Welcome to the Right Take Podcast, news, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Welcome back to the Right Take Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Tapson. Thanks so much for joining me here at the intersection of politics and culture again. Well, thanks to all the pre-election madness, the coup in the White House, the temporary disappearance of Joe Biden, and of course, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, all of that stuff has dominated the news cycle lately, while other issues, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with all of its attendant issues like the campus demonstrations and the ongoing violent domestic and international protests, the hostage situation involving those taken by the terror group Hamas in the October 7th attacks in Israel, all of that has been kind of relegated to the background of the news, but it's still a very serious issue, one which my guest today is going to address. He's a scholar and a gentleman who's very knowledgeable about anti-Semitism on campus and off. He's been a longtime contributor to the Freedom Center's frontpagemag.com. I've known him for years and years, and the guy is a wealth of information and wisdom about anti-Semitism, most specifically campus anti-Semitism. So we're going to discuss that today and get caught up on developments in that arena. So stay tuned. You don't want to miss this conversation. And let me say, as always, please take a moment to subscribe to The Right Take if you haven't already, so that you can keep up with the conversations we're having here with important thinkers, writers, pundits, scholars, and storytellers. And if you like what you hear, a positive review would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. And don't touch that dial. My guest today at the intersection of politics and culture is the author of 6 books, including Dispatches from the Campus War Against Israel and Jews. He's President Emeritus of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. That's an organization with 40,000 members worldwide. He's published hundreds and hundreds of articles, op-eds, and book chapters on campus anti-Semitism, free speech, terrorism, Middle East politics, and more. Everywhere from the New York Times to Wall Street Journal and back again. He's a very smart guy. And a very dapper gent, too, I might add. Richard Cravatts, welcome to the Right Take Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you on. Let's start off with your background. Tell us a little bit about your history and what led you to focus so much of your work on anti-Semitism in general and campus anti-Semitism more specifically.
I had been writing op-ed pieces starting about 25 or 30 years ago on real estate development and affordable housing, because that was during the 80s when there was a real estate boom and affordability became a problem. So I was looking at that problem, and then I started writing about what was happening on campuses, writing about the free speech and problems with a double standard when it came to speaking about conservative values or speaking about Israel in defense of the Jewish state. And I started to see that there was a pervasive and growing animosity towards Israel that was being institutionalized by many universities, pushed by radical organizations, both at the student and faculty level. And I started tracing the development of that. So my first book was written almost 15 years ago, published by the Horowitz Freedom Center, by the way. And even though many people have just learned about this after October 7th and what happened on many university campuses in the wake of that attack on Israel, this has been going on, and the rhetoric surrounding Israel and the Palestinians has been vituperative and destructive and libelous for at least 15 years that I've been observing what's going on.
Yeah, I remember interviewing you a couple of times for Front Page Mag, all the way back in 2016 for the first time, about your book Dispatches from the Campus War Against Israel and Jews. And again, only a couple of years ago, about an ebook that you wrote for the Freedom Center called Jew Hatred Rising, The Perversities of the Campus War Against Israel and the Jews. Those books, and in fact, all your writing about campus anti-Semitism over the years, That's all become even more relevant today than ever before, haven't they?
It is. And as I said, many of us have been observing what's been going on with the radicalization of student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine and the Muslim Student Association and other groups that have been solely focused on demonizing Israel on their campuses. They pretend to be pro-Palestinian, but by definition, being pro-Palestinian means being anti-Israel. So these groups are doing nothing on behalf of the Palestinians. They're not trying to lead them to peace and to accepting some kind of a compromise with Israel. They're not trying to get them to stop inciting terrorism. They're not trying to encourage their leaders not to pay terrorists to murder Jews and then pay their families a bounty in a pay-to-slay program. They're not doing anything on behalf of anything that would assist the Palestinians in achieving peace and some kind of stability in their culture and lives. Instead, their entire movement is based on demonizing Israel with the intent of making it a pariah state and in their delusional minds, leading them to a time when Israel will disappear, when there will be a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
Yeah, you've written before that being pro-Palestinian is not actually about being pro-Palestinian or about Palestinian statehood anyway. It's, as you say, it's actually about ultimately about the eradication of Israel. Let me ask you about the Students for Justice. I'm going to jump around a little bit because I was going to ask you later on about Students for Justice in Palestine, but now might be a good time since you brought it up. Tell us about the influence of this just seemingly ubiquitous campus group, Students for Justice in Palestine, what their agenda is. You've already alluded to it, and how they've created an atmosphere on college campuses today that's just openly hostile to Jewish students and faculty alike.
SJP has chapters on over 200 campuses now, and unfortunately, there's now a new growing organization called Faculty for Justice in Palestine, which is comprised of faculty members who might have been members of the Students for Justice in Palestine years ago when they were students and have now taken the reins over as faculty members and advisors to the student groups. They're particularly pernicious because they have more influence on a campus since they are permanent parts of the campus, and particularly if they're tenured professors, it's impossible for a university to remove them or to ignore their influence. But Students for Justice in Palestine, funded by some questionable sources, such as the American Muslims for Palestine, which is a blanket organization that is operating much in the same way that the Holy Land Foundation did before it was indicted for supporting terrorism, that they're funding Students for Justice in Palestine and other anti-Israel groups for the sole purpose of promoting this false narrative about Israel. And they're the ones that initiate the boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolutions at university campuses. They're the ones that are demanding that universities divest from companies that do business with Israel and supposedly companies that profit from the genocide that Israel is committing against the Palestinians. They're the ones that march in front of Hillels and on Jewish holidays have anti-Israel demonstrations. And they're the ones that at Canadian universities try to get the university to stop serving kosher food because it somehow links the university to Israel and the complicity in the genocide. They're a particularly perverse group. We learned from a leaked Students for Justice in Palestine memo at Binghamton University that they said to their fellow members that they weren't interested in an actual dialogue with pro-Israel groups or people that had alternative views than they do. In fact, they want their voice to be the only voice. So they try to shout down any pro-Israel voices. They try to get any pro-Israel speakers to be deplatformed before they can come to the university. Or if they do come to the university, they will protest and try to shout down and suffocate any views that support Israel and contradict their false narrative. The problem with Students for Justice in Palestine and the anti-Israel groups and faculty in general is that their whole ideology is based on a false narrative, that they're promoting a fiction about a country supposedly called Palestine that existed before Israel, that some European Jews after the Holocaust showed up in the Holy Land, took Palestine over, displaced the indigenous population, stole the land, and created Israel on the remains of what was proposed to be Palestine. Of course, none of this is historically true. And they also are the ones that perpetuate the lies about Israel being an apartheid state and committing genocide and deserving the treatment that they get. SJP was right in the front of the line the day after October 7th, blaming Israel solely for what had happened to it. This is, as I always like to quote Melanie Phillips, this is the world turned upside down, where the victim becomes the oppressor in their mind. So they've been a particularly virulent and destructive force on campus. And after October 7th, and in the demonstrations that we saw at Columbia and other universities, their virulence has now come to the surface in a way that they're not even hiding their base anti-Semitism, which is at root of much of their activism. They always pretended that anti-Zionism had nothing soever to do with anti-Semitism, but we know that that's not true, and they have proven it because many of the chants at the protests during the spring, where we saw campuses exploding and tents being put up and buildings being taken over, were complete with the kinds of chants that made it obvious that this was not just about Israel, that it was more about Jews and being Jewish, and that the attacks on the Jewish state were not just criticism of Israel, as people like to say, but they were actual rank anti-Semitism at base. There were people on campuses that were telling Jews to go back to Poland and begging terrorists to attack Tel Aviv, and that they were going to have October 7th 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, forever. This is particularly outrageous in the context of university campuses. Think about the difference between the supposed tolerant students on campuses who are afraid of microaggressions, who have professors that put trigger warnings on a syllabus for Shakespearean plays because there's talk of rape or incest in the play, who have to have safe spaces because a conservative speaker is coming to campus, and they have to have therapy because Donald Trump was elected, and they had to have Play-Doh and a quiet room where they could get counseling for being faced with the onslaught of conservative thought. And these same students are now marching for the death of Jews, calling for an intifada. Intifada, long live the intifada. What does that mean? That means that they're wishing that the murder of Jews in Israel will continue, and will continue until Palestine, that fictional place that never existed, will be free of Jews, obviously, from the river to the sea. It's an exterminationist plea and a chant that can't be looked at in any other way as these entitled privileged college students safe on American campuses calling for the death of Jews. It's repugnant. If you put it in a different context, and they were talking about the aftermath of George Floyd, and there was a group on campus that blamed blacks for being killed by the police and saying that their high crime rate made it possible for them to be killed by a policeman, and that it was inevitable and reasonable that they would, and that they were saying send them back to Africa or string them up. This is the same kind of rhetoric that's being directed at Jews and pro-Israel and pro-Zionist students on campus. It's outrageous that the people on campus that think they're the most tolerant are the ones that are spewing this hatred and rank anti-Semitism. There's no two ways to look at it.
Yeah, I think in your writing you've used the phrase weaponized intolerance about that, which I think is a great way to describe it. That go-to argument that criticism of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitic, that you hear that very often, and very often from the same people on college campuses who are chanting from the river to the sea and waving Hamas and Hezbollah flags. And what about the, what about the intellectual and moral dishonesty of campus women's studies feminists who turn a blind eye to like the absolutely savage misogyny of Hamas while calling for the eradication of Israel?
There's a clear disconnect, and in the same way that we have accused people of having Trump derangement syndrome, there's clearly an Israel derangement syndrome that's prevalent in the minds of many progressives and so-called liberals on college campuses, that you see people marching, for example, this Queers for Palestine. Queers for Palestine is so Orwellian that it makes a joke of itself when gay people come out in support of a terrorist group that would gladly throw them off of a roof if they were in Gaza or Nablus or any part of the West Bank where the Palestinians are in control. It's a way that progressives show that they are for the victim at all costs, even though it is morally and rationally impossible to make a connection between the behavior and intent of Hamas or even the Palestinian movement in general, which is based on the destruction of Israel and the refusal to live beside a Jewish state. This idea that a two-state solution is the way that we're going to remedy this conflict is theoretically a good idea, except we have one problem, that the Palestinians have indicated in 1937, in 1947, in 1967, in 2000, in 2005, that they're not interested in the state, that they've turned down every offer of statehood. So the issue is not the absence of a Palestinian state. The issue is that the Palestinians and their leadership will not accept a Jewish state, that they will not recognize a Jewish sovereignty on what now they claim is Palestinian land, that even Jerusalem and the Western Wall and all of the Jewish historical sites, which go back to biblical times, are somehow Palestinian land, and that Jews have no tie and no right and no claim to that land. And so there's, as you know, on campuses and in liberal thought, there's this dichotomy of victim and victimized, oppressor and oppressed. And Israel and Jews, because they now are said to enjoy white privilege and are considered to be white, are in the oppressor bucket. And gay people and Muslims and Palestinians, by extension, are in the victim bucket. And so that enables feminists and gay people and others who who normally wouldn't share any kind of ideological similarities with Hamas or the Palestinians to form a kind of a unholy alliance, as David Horowitz has put it, in a way that Israel has made an enemy of people that really, if they thought about their relationship, wouldn't have much to do with each other at all.
Let's talk about the roots of all of this, which I guess stem from academia, right? Just like cultural Marxism, generally speaking, is rooted in or came out of colleges and universities decades ago. Did all of this anti-Israel and the anti-Zionist and anti-Semitism that we're seeing now, does all of that kind of stem from the universities where they took on these concepts like diversity and multiculturalism and then perverted them in ways that suited their agenda? Is that fair to say that it kind of stems from the universities and spreads outward from there?
It seems that way. Universities are the one.
I mean, I know anti-Semitism goes back, thousands of years, but just what we're seeing today in the culture, is that really sort of flowing out of the universities?
There's an undercurrent of anti-Semitism, and Israel has provided anti-Semites with a convenient way to hate Jews because they don't have to publicly admit that they hate Jews anymore. They can just show their revulsion against the Jewish state because Israel is the Jew of nations. And so it became unfashionable and impolite to be an open anti-Semite, but Israel provided traditional anti-Semites with a way to hate Jews, but in a kind of furtive way. A lot of that is falling away now because the case against Israel is so thunderous and widespread and vicious that now Jews are being blamed for creating Israel and for enabling Israel to commit the atrocities that it's accused of committing. Did it start in the universities? Yes, and universities, of course, train diplomats and parents that teach their children certain attitudes, and they create professors that prolong this activism and help foster a new generation of anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist people. Part of this has to do with the obsession about race and this victimhood and victimizer concept that I just mentioned, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is rampant and festering on university campuses almost everywhere, has helped promote this idea about the imbalance between different groups and how adjustments have to be made to accommodate the lack of achievement of some groups and the excess of achievement of others. Jews, as I said, are now considered to be white and therefore enjoy white privilege. And that has made many administrators who are in the thrall of this DEI to not take Jewish claims of anti-Semitism or Jewish claims of students who feel that they're being harassed or prejudiced against. Administrators are not taking these claims seriously because they feel that Jews don't need protection because they're in a privileged class. And so this division, it actually started after the 1967 war, where Israel, which had been a victim, surrounded by hostile armies that had tried to destroy the nascent state of Israel. After 1967, when Israel came out as a Goliath instead of a David and had taken over so much territory and became what they were accused of being an occupier, the perception of Israel changed so that they became a occupier, an oppressor, a victimizer. And so they were put in that box. And on university campuses where there is this prevalent dichotomy of the oppressed and the oppressors, the racists and the racial victims, the people that are not achieving because of supposed systematic racism and transphobia and homophobia and all of Islamophobia and all of those victim terms. Israel and Jews on university campuses are looked at as being in the oppressor box, and that's unfortunately made it reasonable and seems to have justified the anti-Israel rhetoric and behavior that we saw very clearly and dramatically after October 7th on university campuses.
A moment ago, I mentioned a phrase you used that I liked, the weaponized intolerance, but you've got another phrase that I think is a great one, the moral sadism, as you call it, of academics who have managed to recast Israelis and Jews as Nazis, inflicting apartheid and genocide on the Palestinians. How have they been so successful, flipping the narrative in order to demonize Israel and Jews? Is it because the left basically owns the cultural outlets like entertainment and education and the news media? How has this narrative managed to become so widespread?
I've written about the Nazification of Israel in several articles because I thought it's part of the process by which Israel is slandered and demonized and made to be a pariah state. What's the Erwin Cutler, who was a member of parliament in Canada and a great human rights activist, said that the worst accusation you could make of somebody in the 20th century, that they were a racist or a Nazi. And I had noted that, isn't it interesting that this is exactly the slander that's given to Israel all of the time? Why is the Nazification of Israel effective for the enemies of Israel? Why do we see signs and placards saying Auschwitz with an equal sign to Gaza, and seeing the Israeli flag with a swastika in the middle of the blue bars? Why is that effective? Because if Israel is made into a Nazi in the same way that they have tried to make Donald Trump into a new Nazi and into a new Hitler, it serves the same purpose, because Hitler and the Nazi regime is the most odious recent historical person and event and group that we can possibly imagine because of the horrors of what they committed. So if you can convince people that Israel is the new Third Reich, that they are committing a genocide and ethnic cleansing against the poor indigenous Palestinians, who are totally innocent, of course, who have never done anything except try to live a peaceful life, that the IDF is a mechanical, militaristic, brutal murderer of innocent Palestinian children. And look at the way that their behavior in this Gaza war has been described. Even though the ratio that Israel has achieved in Gaza is one combatant death to one civilian death, that's unheard of in urban warfare, that no one, including the United States in Afghanistan or Iraq, has ever achieved such a low ratio of combatant to civilian. And this is in a war where Hamas purposely embeds itself in civilian neighborhoods and in apartment buildings and in schools and in mosques with the with the sole intention of having Israel kill innocent civilians. Yet the outside world is calling the targeted death of Hamas with some collateral damage a genocide. Seriously, a genocide with 25,000 deaths, half of which are combatants? I don't think so. And they're also being blamed for creating a famine in Gaza. And even though Israel has, in an unheard of way, which no other warring nation would ever do, has been supplying aid to the civilians of its enemy. But they are still compared to the Third Reich, that their behavior is genocidal, that they are murderous, that they have no right to defend themselves. Why do they do this? Because if the world can believe that Israel, in fact, is equivalent to the Nazis, that their behavior is Nazi-like, and that they are being genocidal, who would come to their defense? Why would any reasonable person defend Israel? So this Nazification, though grotesque and inaccurate, is effective in making uneducated or ill-informed people believe that Israel is a pariah, murderous state that is not worth defending and doesn't deserve anybody coming to its defense. There was one of the activists at Columbia University, Kamani James, became infamous when he recorded a session he had with some Columbia officials where he said that he thought that Zionists should be killed, and that he said it sort of matter-of-factly. He said, if there was a movement, he said, and he compared them to Hitler, he said, if you had the ability to kill Hitler, he said, wouldn't we do it? He said, and we have an ideology, Zionism, which is responsible for the deaths of hundreds and thousands and millions. These are his words, not mine, of deaths. Wouldn't we want those people to die? And this is a Columbia student who was accepted to Columbia because he had a record of activism in Boston, Massachusetts, where he had been a student in high school and had already shown himself to be a radical progressive. He was accepted at Columbia, obviously, for that very reason. And here he is, a seemingly normal person at an elite American university, matter-of-factly saying that why shouldn't we kill Zionists? You know, what is a Zionist? To the enemies of Israel, Zionism is an ideology like communism or socialism or Nazism. Zionism is self-determination of the Jews. It just means that they have the right to a state, and that most Jews, not all, but most Jews feel a connection to Israel and to Jewish self-determination and would consider themselves Zionism. It's not an ideology as its enemies proclaim that is based on the oppression of the Palestinians or the wiping out of another ethnic group, the Palestinians, which it clearly is not. It has nothing to do with the Palestinians. It's just Jewish self-determination. And the question is, why are only Jews denied the right to be having a state? Why are only Jews denied self-determination where we don't do the same thing for any other country?
In the wake of the barbaric October 7th attacks in Israel, you would think that there would be a worldwide surge of empathy and support and sympathy for Israel and Jews, but it was exactly the opposite. It seemed like a worldwide surge of anti-Semitism and support for Hamas. Is that because that this narrative of Israel being and Zionism being equated with Nazism has been so successful that it's just permeated the culture so much that that people saw it as justified, saw the attacks as justified, rather?
Exactly. And I think there were two reasons for it. One was that the actions of Hamas on that day, where it was not a matter of them coming across the border and shooting some soldiers, But as you know, killing of 1,200 people included the beheading of babies, the burning alive of people, the killing of children in front of their parents, the killing of grandparents, the taking of hostages. It was pre-civilizational barbaric behavior that normally would repulse any moral or reasonable person. Instead, and from the reaction of some people, there was one professor that said he was, energized by what had happened, and people came out and applauded Hamas. The reaction, I think, against Israel, the next week, even before Israel had retaliated, which didn't happen for 3 or 4 weeks, there were people, including 30 groups at Harvard, that immediately came out and blamed the Hamas barbarism on Israel, completely on Israel, and put no blame on Hamas, as did many others. I think part of the reason was that the activists who despise Israel and who had been working tirelessly for its eradication and demonization wanted to shift the blame from Hamas and put it squarely on Israel for existing. And if you have promulgated this theory that Israel is an oppressor and that it has no right to be there in the first place, that the Jewish state should never have been created, that it's on stolen land, that they ethnically cleansed an indigenous population of Palestinians and took their things and took their cities and destroyed their villages and expelled them, and then built Israel on top of Palestine, that you think that the whole of Israel is an illegitimate enterprise, that it's frequently called a regime. It's not even recognized as a state by its enemies. If you believe all of those things, then you say that this attack, of course, was justified. And so Israel is to blame for being there. That's basically the message. First, if you support Hamas after October 7th and you demonize and attack Israel for being attacked, it kind of lessens the horrors of what Hamas actually did. And it also gives you another opportunity to say, well, they deserved it. They're the Nazi of nations. They shouldn't be there in the first place. They've been oppressing the Palestinians. It's an apartheid racist regime. All of those things in their minds are true. So this resistance that rose up is fully justified and expected. And there are many who claim, although they're incorrect about it, that the Palestinians have a legal right to resist occupation. Well, as we know, Gaza hasn't been occupied since 2005. So I don't know what those people are even talking about. But many people on the other side who believe that Israel has no right to exist believe that all of Israel is occupied land, even Tel Aviv and Haifa and Tiberias and cities that are inside Israel proper. From the river to the sea is what they want and what they feel that they're entitled to, because they believe that all of Israel, including Israel proper, but also Gaza and the West Bank, are Arab Palestinian land, and that Israel has no right to be there in the first place.
All of these pro-Hamas demonstrations and campus takeovers, they've kind of fallen out of the news cycle lately, but does that mean that it's fading away, or has it just become the new normal on college campuses?
I think we're going to have a terrible fall on university campuses. unfortunately, because of the behavior of university presidents, many of whom seem to, if not support, sympathize with the actions of the protesters. You saw at Columbia, for example, the feckless response by the administration to the encampment and the taking over of the building. And we also saw that in several universities, when 20 or 40 people were arrested, almost half of them weren't even college students. They were outsiders who had come in. They were professional agitators. Uh, we've learned, although I haven't seen this confirmed anywhere, but there seems to be funding and support from Iran to promote these demonstrations. And groups like American Muslims for Palestine that I mentioned earlier that are funding Students for Justice in Palestine may be funneling money into these demonstrations and paying activists, professional agitators to come onto campus to promote this. They don't want to let this go because it's been very effective. At Northwestern University, for example, instead of being punished, the university agreed to the demands of these protesters, and they are setting up a Palestinian Studies Center and giving scholarships to Palestinian students. Seriously? So Hamas attacks Israel in a barbaric way, and the Biden administration wants to reward them by giving a new Palestinian state as a reward. What's the lesson there? That terrorism gets you what you want. So these college students commit their own version of terrorism without killing anybody, but taking over buildings, harassing Jewish students, making Zionists leave campus, demanding that the universities divest, wanting to have Palestinians and anti-Israel students on the advisory committees that decide on the investments for the university, setting up a Muslim student dorms, and all kinds of things that reward the bad behavior of these protesters who are breaking the law and not even following the university's own code of conduct.
What do we do to root all this out? How do we tackle campus anti-Semitism on an institutional level? Because it seems so just deeply embedded in the system. And what about, and this may be too big a question, but what about addressing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the culture, generally speaking? How do we begin to reverse that narrative?
In the culture, it's an impossibility because, as you mentioned and we spoke about earlier, there's a 2,000 or 3,000 year history of anti-Semitism, and that exists in the world. Daniel Goldenhagen wrote an interesting book called The Devil That Never Dies about anti-Semitism, and he looks at the different types of anti-Semites. Some of it is based on religion, where Jews are the killers of Christ. Some of it is based on Muslim antipathy towards Jews based on Quranic traditions, and some of it is based on cultural envy of Jews. And anti-Semitism is a strange, contradictory disease that has existed for a long time, and it's not going to go away. It's strange that there's only 15 million or so Jews in the world, but they capture the imagination of billions of people in a way that's disproportionate to their presence on Earth. On campuses, it's difficult. We're taking different approaches to it. Some of them are making these universities pay a legal cost for not protecting Jewish students under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And groups like the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under the Law, for example, has been suing universities on behalf of students that have been harassed or injured by a hostile environment that universities have allowed to be created on campuses in a way that they would not have allowed had the students been Black or gay or Muslim or other members of other protected groups. So the legal approach, it's a difficult and complicated approach, but it does get the attention of universities and makes them realize that they have to be more diligent in protecting students and making sure that the kind of behavior that we saw in the protests in the spring at Columbia and Harvard and Yale and Brown and other elite institutions and in California as well doesn't continue without being at least criticized by university leaders, if not shut down when they violate the code of conduct of those respective universities. That's one approach. Obviously, great numbers of people have bought into this false narrative of what Israel is, how it was created, and what it is now. They overlook the amazing accomplishments of the Israeli economy, that it's number 2 in venture capital firms, and their development of high tech and medical and biochemical and water resources and all kinds of advancements in science and medicine and so forth are remarkable given its small size and its achievements and its achievement in being the only democracy of any sort in a Middle East surrounded by totalitarian and authoritarian regimes with no human and civil rights for its citizens. So it's a beacon of hope, not to mention the way that it built itself, from sand dunes into vibrant cultural and social state with a city like Tel Aviv that's the size of Miami and has all of the Western style values and transparency of law and human rights that any Western democracy has. That's all ignored, and the narrative focuses on the alleged racism and apartheid and militarism and ethnic cleansing that it supposedly has perpetrated against the poor, hapless Palestinians. The Palestinians themselves are an invention that didn't even exist before the 1960s, and yet they're accepted, as fact, and that many people assume that there was a country called Palestine. Here you have students at a place like Columbia University, one of the top universities in the country, or at Stanford, or at Harvard University, the top universities in the world, who believe that there's a country called Palestine that needs to be freed. What are they talking about? That's historically inaccurate. That any, a 5-year-old could figure that out by doing a Google search in 10 minutes, that there was never a country called Palestine. Yet here you have Ivy League college students marching around yelling that Palestine will be free, as if that this is a fact.
It's very depressing. Richard, what are you working on now, and how can people best keep up from day to day with what you are doing?
I have a book in the works called it's actually done. I'm just cleaning it up. It's The Slow Suicide of the University. How an obsession with race and Israel has destroyed academia. So it talks about many of the points we've been talking about now. This victimizer, this obsession with race and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and affirmative action and lowering standards of academic achievement to accommodate minority groups that otherwise wouldn't be able to compete based on merit. And there's a destruction of merit going on. You see this even in medical schools, which is kind of concerning for those who are observing what's going on. And you see it in presidential administrations, where people are hired based on their color as opposed to their performance and abilities. That's a destructive obsession that universities currently are involved with. We've now that affirmative action has been struck down to some extent by the courts, I think we might start heading in the right direction. The problem is that enormous bureaucracies spending millions of dollars annually have been constructed within universities to support this diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, where each part of a university, every department, every graduate school has its own diversity officer whose sole function is to help students find themselves as victims and to make sure that they're protected and accommodated in ways that are patently unfair to the people that don't receive that same attention, who are ignored because they're Asian or white or conservative or Jewish. So that's all part of what is weakening and destroying universities from within, based on their own obsession with tolerance and equity and so forth. These buzzwords, which are important to them, but are not making universities stronger and are taking them off of their mission, which is to preserve knowledge and to have people debate and enter into dialogue about important topics and come to the table with reasonable feelings about things without being stifled by this necessity of being politically correct and saying the right thing and not offending certain groups. It's anti-academic and it's destructive to universities at large.
Very interesting. Well, I look forward to that book. Let me know when it's available, and I'll have you back on again. Richard Cravatts, thanks so much for coming to the Right Take podcast. Keep up the good work, sir.
I appreciate you having me.
Listeners, find Richard Cravatts online. Check out what he's up to. His writing and speaking in this respect and on these topics is indispensable. And thank you, as always, for joining me here at the intersection of politics and culture. Don't forget to subscribe to The Right Take so that you can keep up with all the important conversations we're having here. And if you like what you hear, please leave that positive review. Be seeing you. The Right Take with Mark Tapson is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.